All right, so let's take you back to Washington now, where our international news correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease is standing by with the South African delegation. In the main, he's with Minister of Agriculture John Steenhuisen. Sherwin, it's over to you.
Mfundo, thanks very much. Minister Steenhuisen is just in conversation with some journalists to my left, but I'm going to get him to walk over to me in just a second. I'm speaking a bit loudly so that he can hear me. But just to recap there, a long press conference now by President Ramaphosa in the aftermath of that Oval Office meeting. And I think the big takeaway is that engagement is going to continue between the United States and South Africa. Another big takeaway, Mfundo, is the fact that he doesn't want interlocutors and people that were observing and our constituency around the world to basically base this engagement on what they saw play out in the Oval Office. Apparently they went behind closed doors, they had a lovely lunch, and the issue of white Afrikaners was peripheral to engagement around geopolitics, engagement around the closing of divisions around issues of peace in Gaza, peace in Ukraine. He said, for example, the issue of the ICJ didn't come up. And you also heard from Minister Park Starr of Trade, Industry and Competition that the focus was very much about putting a new trade and investment framework as it relates to the future of AGOA, as it relates to trade and investment, as it relates to the exploration of critical minerals and partnering with the United States in that sense. So it's certainly a positive posture from the President of South Africa in terms of what happened in the aftermath to what we saw play out on live television. And so engagement is going to continue. Remember that this is a strategic relationship that has suffered in the last number of months in the aftermath of that executive order on February 7th, I think it was, that President Trump signed in relation to South Africa. And so there is a positive trajectory here, certainly from the South African perspective. It was a cordial meeting. They talked about golf. They exchanged gifts. Each one gave each other a book. President Ramaphosa talked in the Oval Office about giving President Trump a book about golf. I can't remember exactly whether he gave us the details of the book that he received from President Trump, but certainly a positive trajectory in terms of the relationship moving forward. I'm just looking over to my left. Minister Steenhuisen is just busy with an interview. He'll join us shortly, but if you have a question for me, I'm happy to answer it.
Sherwin, we heard the president there touch on G20, the summit specifically, indicating that he had in fact insisted that President Donald Trump partake or at least be present when he is to hand over the chair to the United States. And he also indicated that President Donald Trump just stated that he would be carefully considering that. We don't know what that actually means.
We don't know, right? Because what is said today could change tomorrow, given the different persuasions. It depends on which direction the wind is blowing. And I think what you certainly heard from South Africa's president is that there would be engagement in terms of G20 priorities. That seems to be the narrative now, that there will be engagement from the United States. Of course, you'll remember there was concern that Marco Rubio didn't come to the foreign ministers meeting. You saw Scott Bessent not come to the finance ministers meeting, the ministerials that have been held at that quite high level. And of course, the highest level is going to be the Leaders Summit in November. And what we heard from President Ramaphosa is that indications are that President Trump is going to come in November. He has, of course, extended an invite to President Trump for a state visit to South Africa. And certainly from the South African perspective, that now appears to be a course that has been set based on the strategic relationship that is being renewed now, engagement now at the highest level, strategic relationship that is being reset. And of course, the big focus here is getting collaboration between the G20, the United States and members of the G20, in particular in the sense that South Africa is going to hand over the baton once its presidency concludes to the United States. And so they really want President Trump to come to South Africa and really make that as smooth a transition as you saw between Brazil and South Africa. Minister John Steenhuisen, Minister of Agriculture and the leader of the Democratic Alliance, joining me now now in conversation. Minister, you had an opportunity to speak in the Oval Office. Was that a bit of a surprise? And how did that moment go?
Yeah, certainly it was a surprise, but and a bit daunting given the sort of close nature of the meeting. But I think some important things needed to be said today in order to get the reality about South Africa on the table. Look, it was always going to be a tough meeting. I don't think anyone was under any illusion going into the meeting that it was going to be an easy meeting, and I certainly think it was robust and frank, but I certainly think that South Africa got today an opportunity to put a little bit of our story on the table about why we formed the government of national unity, to keep precisely the people that Mr. Trump was very exercised about today, showing videos in the Oval Office of them, Mr. Malema, Mr. Zuma. We formed the government of national unity precisely to prevent the breakers from getting into government. We've chosen to work the centre as builders in order to advance South Africa's economic growth.
In the prelude to this engagement, you made it quite clear that your main objective here is expanding the trade relationship. You mentioned, for example, a place called Citrusdal in the Western Cape, where AGOA has been fundamental to the economy in that region. Did you get a sense that I think it's $1 billion relationship already, right? 20 billion rand. Is that going to expand based on what you felt?
I certainly think so. I think we had a very positive meeting with Ambassador Greer, the US Trade Representative, together with Minister Tau on the Monday. And I think it was very clear that they wish to keep the relationship open with South Africa. Obviously, they want us to be a little bit more ambitious about what we're offering on tariffs. And we've gone away, as Minister Tau said, and have put a few other things on the table. What I've been trying to do is to try and deal with some of the irritants that the Americans feel that they don't have fair access to our market. And so we've finalized some issues that they were having with blueberry imports. And by the end of this month, that protocol will be finalized and American blueberries will be able to come in on a counter-seasonal basis. The same with poultry. We've introduced a self-ban, self-lift process to deal with the avian influenza issue, and 25 states have taken us up on that and have already started to submit to the protocols, which will see, I think, more Americans having access to that market. So that's being dealt with. And obviously I'm committed to moving as many trade irritants as possible in order to ensure that our exposure to the US economy, things like citrus, wine, table grapes and nuts, remain in place.
Is there a sense that those areas will now expand, right? I mean, and the basis of that is, your statement before you came here, you talked about the unemployment figures that went up. This trade relationship is sacrosanct in terms of achieving the broader objectives in terms of economic development and reducing poverty in South Africa, right?
Of course, and I mean, it's very difficult to redirect these types of products in the short term. Obviously, that's a longer term strategy. But in the short term, we've got to retain favorable access to the US market. Otherwise, places like Citrusdal will literally have to lay off hundreds and hundreds of workers if they don't have a market anymore. Remember, the only citrus coming to America is that from the Western and Northern Cape. And so it is very concentrated. And it's obviously very important that we keep that open. But there's also opportunity to expand our trade here. And we were clear about that with Ambassador Greer. And he also mentioned things like mangoes and avocados, where America has a huge demand. We've got a good supply. And provided we can come up with a fair and favorable arrangement between the two countries, I think that we've got a huge potential to expand our agricultural offering and exposure to the United States.
Yeah, it's a question I asked the president. I said, if you deal with this vexing issue, the Afrikaner issue, you guys were going to go into a room, discuss that. If you get that out the way, is there potential for this relationship really blossoming? Give us your broad takeaway. The president had an opportunity now to say that, do not base this discussion only on what you saw in the Oval Office. What are your takeaways from the
I would agree. I think we had a really constructive lunch, and President Trump is a very warm and generous host, and it was very an interesting lunch and great to be with him and his team. I think that the meeting, the bilateral meeting over the lunch was very constructive and a lot more focused on some of the issues that we could be working close and collaborating on. I'm convinced that we've got to get now, there's a very clear message. We have to get on top of farm murders. We can't pretend they're not happening. We can't explain them away. We've got to now actually get on top of dealing with them. But I think it was very important today to set the record straight that this isn't targeted at a particular race group. There are black farmers, black farm workers, whose names are also on the Wall of Remembrance at the Nampo Showgrounds, that are represented by those white crosses. And that what we need to do is to de-racialize the issue and actually get to the heart of actually getting to the problem that's holding us back from really getting on top of farm murders in South Africa. And I think it's also very important to have distinguished that the words of Mr. Malema and Mr. Zuma are not the words of this government. That is not the view of this government. I regard farmers as absolutely essential to our country's food security and well-being, and we need every farmer we can have and keep in South Africa.
It's also not just a matter of getting on top of farm murders, it's murders writ large,
Yes,
right? Farmers are not the only people that are being killed in South Africa. There's a crime problem.
We've got a crime problem in South Africa, and I certainly am never going to sugarcoat that. We need to be honest, we need to own it, but we also need to then set out, and I think that's what the White House and others want to see, what are you doing about it? And I think we need to be more clear about the steps we're going to take to work with SAPS, with private security companies, with intelligence-led operations to get on top of crime in South Africa.
There was a lot of talk from, for example, Johan Rupert calling for collaboration with drones and tech and recapacitating rural police stations. Did you hear more about that in the private?
Well, I made the point very clearly to the President that it is actually American technology that's helping, for instance, the city of Cape Town and the Western Cape, although policing is a national function, get on top of gang violence. It is great technology that allows us, through the ShotSpotter program, to identify criminals, firearms, firearm usage, and hotspots. And we said the more technology we can get, the better it is.
Final question for you. We talked a lot about trade and investment. We talked about AGOA. We talked about geopolitics. We talked about a number of issues. We also talked a lot about golf.
Yes.
So I want to ask, what's your golf game like and what's your handicap?
I do not play golf, so I was just nodding along with large parts of that particular conversation. But there was a lot of golf talk at the table, and obviously it's something that President Trump obviously enjoys talking about. And it was good to actually see him relaxing. And I also think that having the golfers in the room there, I think helped to defang some of the, of the edge. And I think it put the president at ease on both sides, and I think it facilitated the way for us to have a cordial and constructive discussion. So I think Ernie and Retief and Johan were a great addition to the team.
Only question is, where is Gary Player? Right, Minister, good to see you. Thank you very much. A pleasure to meet you. Thank you. Minister John Steenhuisen is Minister of Agriculture in the Government of National Unity, and of course also the leader of the Democratic Alliance. And Fundo, do you have a question for me?
Yes, indeed. Before I let you go, Sherwin, the meeting discussed the current Ukraine-Russia conflict. I just want us to watch one video there, and then perhaps you can touch a bit on that, what exactly has been stated.
To us, because we would like to see the end of that war.
It's true. I called Zelensky, and they said, that's a strange one. I said, what are you doing in South Africa?
Yes.
That's a strange one.
He's trying to make peace. But we're taking him. We were lucky because we had the great Nelson Mandela, who taught us how to create peace, to make peace. So we were imparting some of those lessons to him, some of those learnings. And I specifically mentioned to him that this is how Nelson Mandela taught us. That when you want to have a peace in a country, do it on an unconditional basis and sit down and talk. And that's precisely what I'm sure he's going to heed.
Well, we're going to see what happens with that one. It's there's a lot of hatred. There's a lot of death. It's a bloodbath.
It is.
I get the,
unfortunately.
I get the satellite pictures of that field, of that killing field. You never saw anything like it in your life. It's horrible. It's a horrible thing that goes on, but I think we've made big progress.
As you hear this show, and President Trump a bit fatigued when it comes to that specific conflict, going on to say there's just a lot of bloodshed. It doesn't seem he's convinced that we will actually see the peace so soon.
Yes, of course. I think that we all knew it was going to be a tough meeting.
Well, remember, we were supposed to see peace in Ukraine on day one of this presidency. We were supposed to see peace in Gaza on day one of this presidency, and it's proved a little harder and a few more obstacles in the way of that trajectory, but certainly not for a lack of effort. That would certainly be the narrative you'd hear from the White House. There's been a lot of engagement at the highest levels, and President Trump saying just the other day that, there's not going to be movement until, for example, he meets with Russian President Vladimir Putin. But what you are seeing is a greater alignment between what was a huge divide initially in this relationship. South Africa's closeness to Russia was perceived as undermining U.S. interests, and now you are seeing direct engagement between the White House and the Kremlin as it relates to peace and movement in that direction. And so there seems to be a cooling in the temperature in terms of the geopolitical divisions. The President Ramaphosa telling the media here earlier that they didn't even bring up the ICJ, which was a sticking point, part of the executive order against South Africa signed on February 7th. And so there seems to be a greater alignment in terms of that, maybe greater collaboration now moving forward. President Ramaphosa talking about the mediation role South Africa has played in terms of prisoner swaps between Russia and Ukraine, in terms of returning children taken from Ukraine to Russia back to their home country. And so one expects there to be greater collaboration based on what President Ramaphosa has said in terms of getting the strategic relationship back on track. Engagement is going to happen, be that on a bilateral level, but also in terms of South Africa's role leading the G20, which is a multilateral fora. And President Trump actually in the White House saying that the G20 and the G7 will not be the G20 or the G7 without the United States. And so there was a forward-leaning posture there from the US president in terms of greater engagement moving forward. Once, of course, those sticking points, the vexing issues like so-called genocide and Afrikaner targeting is resolved. And one imagines that based on the conversation that they had behind closed doors, certainly based on the narrative we've heard from the South African delegation, is that those things will now move forward.
We've got to bolster policing, and I think
to see or observe the silence around the ICJ matter, because a number of commentators ahead of this crucial meeting had been indicating that the white genocide was in fact a fig leaf that America was hiding behind. What they really wanted to discuss was the ICJ case. They wanted to discuss our alignment with Russia or non-alignment stance when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict and just our closeness to China. But really it has come down to the white genocide allegations, in fact.
That I've been working on about this.
Well, I mean, that has, both presidents have accused another country of genocide in the last number of years. President Trump has called what is happening to his perceptions of what is happening to white farmers in South Africa a genocide, but South Africa has also leveled an allegation of genocide against Israel. The difference is that South Africa is seeking to undergird that allegation by following a legal process in terms of the Genocide Convention, which is under the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. And so they are pursuing a legal opinion at the ICJ in terms of either asserting or affirming the allegation of genocide that Israel is perpetrating against Palestinians in Gaza, or dismissing the allegation. There has been no legal process followed by the Trump administration in the claim against South Africa, akin to the State Department's analysis of what is happening in Western Darfur today. There was a legal process followed by Antony Blinken's State Department to then come to that determination. There has been no legal process, and genocide is all about legal determinations. It's a very high bar in terms of determining whether a genocide is happening or not. In fact, you see reluctance from officials at the United Nations in terms of pronouncing themselves, despite being at the center of humanitarian relief and certainly the efforts to bring humanitarian relief in Gaza. So this is a legal question. You cannot shoot from the hip in terms of genocide. South Africa is, in a sense, doing it the right way, the legal route. We have yet to see that from the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. And then in closing, the meeting between the two leaders also touched on peace efforts in Africa, especially in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Africa's peacekeeping efforts on the continent. I just want us to listen to this clip and then we can expand on that.
Particularly SADC, our Southern African Development Community, has for years been seeking to foster peace in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So all efforts, including those from outside the continent and inside the continent, are really worthwhile. we are removing our troops from there so that peace can then prevail in that whole area. And we hope that with the support of the international community, we will really have peace in that area. It's so vital, it's so important for the whole region.
That was just that part on the DRC specifically, especially with our SADC mission now withdrawing to allow for at least diplomatic process to take place and for the two nations to find each other. Just talk to us about that.
Controlled briefly by drones, almost on an hourly basis. You could have drones going over.
Right, so the conflict in Eastern DRC is somewhat of an unfamiliar topic perhaps for President Trump, certainly not in the vein of the Gaza situation or Ukraine. And of course South Africa, whether as part of MONUSCO in Eastern DRC or as part of the SADC missions, SAMI DRC, which has started withdrawing all their troops and equipment from that region. We have now seen greater engagement by the United States, particularly following the mediation role that has also been played by Qatar. You'll recall that there was a meeting between President Tshisekedi and President Kagame of Rwanda recently, and then there was a statement of intent in terms of a ceasefire. And then the United States Special Advisor, Dr. Masoud Boulos, also engaging in that area. So the United States also involved, SADC also involved, and there does seem to be some momentum in terms of movement in the right direction there. You would have also seen recently at the CEO forum in West Africa recently, which President Ramaphosa attended, he was seated alongside President Paul Kagame of Rwanda. So there does seem to be a consensus, certainly, between the United States and South Africa about what needs to happen in Eastern Congo. But be under no illusion, it's a very complicated region. Countries from around the world have struggled to arrest the situation, particularly the proliferation of armed groups that populate Eastern DRC, not just the M23, not just Mai Mai, and the list goes on. And so that will be a work in process and will require collaboration from the big powers, the small powers, the regional powers. Everybody needs to get around the table in terms of getting all those different entities on the same page. Similarly, which wasn't mentioned in the meeting today, the situation in Sudan, right? The United States has determined that there is a genocide, or a genocide has been perpetrated in terms of the Masalit group in Western Darfur, in the main by the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, that is fighting the Sudanese armed forces. And so lots of conflicts in the world, a lot of engagement that's required. It takes money to engage, but who better than the United States to be involved in resolving the DRC conflict as well?
Sherwin, thank you very much as always for that reportage. That's our US correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease there, who's been monitoring that specific meeting of Team South Africa with the delegation from the United States. And of course, as we heard a bit earlier on, ministers and other members of Team South Africa's delegation are still there to interact with the media.